Scots like to think that Scotland is the best wee country in the world. Aside from stunning scenery, the whole country is incredibly rich in culture, heritage and stories. One of those stories is the inspiration for a new walk. Although there are long-distance walking trails all over the world, this new walk, the Stevenson Way, all 230 miles of it, is probably the only one inspired by a real-life murder. That murder, the shooting of the red fox, was brought to life by one of Scotland's most celebrated authors, Robert Louis Stevenson. In his book Kidnapped, he wove fact and fiction together to create a cracking adventure story. This entire route, all 230 miles of it, follows the epic journey made by the book's hero, the young Davy Balfour, after he escapes from slavers, witnesses a brutal shooting and has to flee for his life.
Robert Louis Stevenson's story is set in 1752, only a few years after the Battle of Culloden, the sad and bloody culmination of the last Jacobite uprising. In 1752, Scotland was still an occupied country, a war zone. The wearing of tartan and the playing of the pipes were banned. Redcoat Hanoverian troops still scoured the highlands and islands looking for rebels and ruthlessly imposing their will. Against this historical backdrop, young Davy Balfour, a lowland Scot, loses both his parents. He's sent to visit his only remaining relative, his uncle Ebenezer, at the house of Shaws near Edinburgh. Determined to hang on to Davy's rightful inheritance, Ebenezer first tries to kill him in a staged accident, and then when that doesn't work, arranges for him to be kidnapped and shipped off as a slave to the Americas. Once on the boat, fate brings Davy a formidable if flamboyant ally in the form of Alan Breck Stewart, a real-life Jacobite courier, fighter and adventurer. The ship's crew discover that Stewart is carrying gold and they try to steal it. Davy and Alan fight them off, and the ship ends up running aground off the island of Mull. And that, believe it or not, is just the start of their adventure, and yours, because it brings us to the very beginning of the long walk back to Edinburgh.
When the ship runs aground, David Balfour struggles ashore right here, Erid. It's the beginning of a long journey home, and it's also the start of the Stevenson Way. From here, the route takes you through remote Highland glens, across rivers, across high mountain passes and desolate moorland, all the way back to Edinburgh, where Stevenson's story ends. What I love about Kidnapped is that it's so much part of the local consciousness here that they've even got it down on a modern-day Ordnance Survey map as Balfour's Bay.
With my stepping ashore, I began the most unhappy part of my adventures. I dared not sit down, for I thought I should have frozen, but took off my shoes and walked to and fro upon the sand. As morning broke, I was afraid to think what had befallen my shipmates, and afraid to look longer at so empty a scene. So I set off eastward along the south coast, hoping to find a house where I might warm myself and perhaps get news of those I had lost. It was the roughest kind of walking. Indeed, the whole, not only of Erid, but of the neighbouring part of Mull, which they call the Ross, is nothing but a jumble of granite rocks with heather in among.
Stevenson knew this island well. He spent 3 weeks here while his father, the famous lighthouse builder Thomas Stevenson, built the Dubh Hartach lighthouse on the Torrin Reef. And again, this is where fact and fiction merge, because the Torrin Reef is the very one that Davy Balfour's boat gets wrecked on in the story. Supposing you'd never read Kidnapped or even heard of Robert Louis Stevenson. Well, there are other reasons for coming here. Mull is one of the best places in Scotland, in fact one of the best places in Europe, to see wildlife. David Greenhaw is a local guide. How did you come to be here, David?
First came here on holiday in the 60s. Used to live in Manchester and came up in the 1970s. So I've been here since 1973, which is 37 years.
And why did you stay?
Live miles, I couldn't find anywhere else I'd prefer to be.
So what is so good about living here?
Peace, the quiet, and there's fantastic scenery wherever you go, and it's always different.
I've noticed the scenery here is quite varied. Can you tell me a bit about that?
I think that's one of the big attractions of the island, especially for wildlife. You've got the big mountain range in the middle, Ben More, 3,000 feet. You've got big rolling hillsides up the north end of the island. And then down the south end of the island, it's much flatter, lower. And we've got the beautiful white sandy beaches. And we've got about 15 pairs of golden eagles. And sea-wise, we've got the otters, got seals, whales, sharks, all turn up at some time or other.
What's the most exciting thing that you've ever seen?
I think it has to be the time I came nearly face to face with an eagle. And this eagle came up the cliff face, right in front of us. And I don't know who was more surprised, him or us. It was an eagle in full flight at 6 foot takes some beating. But the more you hear, the more you see.
From Mull, the Stevenson Way leads us through other landmarks in the book. When the boat sinks, David and his new friend, Alan Breck, the Jacobite adventurer and fighter, get split up. But Alan leaves word with local folk that should Davy survive the sinking, which of course he does, then he's to stay in a particular inn before he catches the Torresay ferry to meet him. And this is where that inn once stood, the remains of the old Fishnish Inn where Stevenson has David Balfour spend the night. It lies just a little way from where David made his crossing to Kinlochaileen. Though in fairness, the ferry has improved a bit since David Balfour's day.
The passage was a very slow affair. There was no wind, and as the boat was wretchedly equipped, we could pull but 2 oars on one side and 1 on the other. And what with the songs, and the sea air, and the good nature and spirit of all concerned, and the bright weather, the passage was a pretty thing to have seen.
The next stop in the Stevenson Way is Kingairloch Morven, where David spent the night before hitching a lift over Loch Linney to Appin. By this stage in the book, David Balfour has survived a kidnapping, a bloody fight aboard ship, a shipwreck, and now he's about to become caught up in a famous murder. And it was the real-life murder and subsequent trial that inspired Stevenson's story. The real Appin murder took place just 6 years after Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite uprising. His attempt to restore his father, James Stuart, to the throne had come to a bloody end at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. 6 years on and the worst of the slaughter was over, but the north and west of Scotland were still occupied by redcoats and the locals were brutally oppressed. The Hanoverian authorities appointed men to collect rents from the estates of the exiled clan chiefs. These men had a tough job to do and they were none too gentle in how they did it. Colin Roy Campbell, the Red Fox, was one of the worst offenders. The Red Fox was a hated man and he was shot dead here in Appin in 1752. At the time, the real-life Alan Breck was believed to have pulled the trigger, but later facts emerged to suggest that this was unlikely. However, the authorities needed a culprit and James of the Glen, a leading Stuart, was executed, despite the fact that there wasn't a shred of evidence against him. To this day, the name of the real gunman, the man who pulled the trigger, remains a mystery, although it's said that his name has been handed down through generations of Stuarts for more than 260 years.
As I was so sitting and thinking, a sound of men and horses came to me through the wood. I saw 4 travellers come into view. The first was a great red-headed gentleman of an imperious and flushed face, who carried his hat in his hand and fanned himself, for he was in a breathing heat. If I'd been better versed in these things, I would have known the tartan to be of the Argyll or Campbell colours. I rose up from the bracken and asked him the way to Aucharn.
Do you know the way to Aucharn?
"And what seek ye in Aucharn?" said Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure. Him they called the Red Fox, for he it was that I had stopped. But just as he turned, there came the shot of a firelock from higher up the hill, and with the very sound of it, Glenure fell upon the road.
That shot was fatal for more than one man. This is where James Stuart was hung for the Appin murder. The authorities wanted to make a point. If there's such a thing as a show trial, then this was a show execution. Stuart was hung on a 30-feet high scaffold, and an armed redcoat guard was stationed beside his remains for nearly 3 years. When his body became so decayed that his bones just fell to the ground, they were picked up and reattached to his rotting corpse with wires. Stuart's remains became a grisly signpost, a clear, brutal, deliberate warning to the clans. See, it said, this is what happens when you defy us. These are the ruins of James Stuart's house, the place Stevenson refers to in Kidnapped as the House of Fear. Hamish McInnes, world-famous mountaineer and the man who's widely regarded as being the father of modern-day mountain rescue in Scotland, still lives in Glencoe today. So tell us a bit about yourself, Hamish.
Well, there's not much to tell, really. Came here primarily for climbing, but also for filming. Because there's so many people climbing, there's a big increase in the number of people going to the hills. There were more accidents. And because they didn't have a proper team here as such, we started the rescue team, and it's still very active today.
So what's so appealing about climbing in Glencoe?
Well, it's a terrific place. I mean, it's the colours and which makes it different, I think, to other mountain areas. It's very colourful here. And also the views, and having it in close proximity to the sea, you get the added advantage of views and the sea locks and things like that. So it's a good training ground because you can concentrate more on climbing rather than kind of walking into the mountains.
So what do you think of the new Stevenson Way that's been launched?
Yeah, I think it's a terrific concept, this, because not only is it scenically, it's a tremendous route, and it's also very long, so it's quite a big undertaking. But also it's got this added aspect of the book. I think all these ingredients make this an especially good choice of a long distance route. When Robbie Louis Stevenson did his reconnaissance, he came down through here, my garden. It wasn't quite like this, and from this point he must have cut up to the side of the house here, up onto the Papa Glencoe. I feel I've got a vested interest in this route.
What do you know of the secret of who killed Colin Campbell?
A friend of mine, who's Brigadier Ian Stewart, he was the custodian of the secret because it was passed down in the Stewart clan. He always told me, he says, well, anybody with common sense can work it out quite easily, you know, but I never succeeded in working it out.
The Stevenson Way passes through some of the most dramatic and rugged mountain terrain in Scotland, so the watchword here is Colcanny, take care. Certainly for Davy Balfour and Alan Breck Stewart, climbing Signal Rock and trying to lay low while redcoats swarmed through the heather below was not a lot of fun.
You are to remember that we lay on the bare top of a rock, like scones upon a girdle. The sun beat upon us cruelly. The rock grew so heated a man could scarce endure the touch of it. And it ran in my mind how strange it was that in the same climate, and at only a few days' distance, I should have suffered so cruelly, first from cold upon my island, and now from heat upon this rock. We could see the soldiers pike their bayonets among the heather, which sent a cold thrill into my vitals, and they would sometimes hang about our rock, so that we scarce dared to breathe.
From there, they hid at Colas na Cone, where Alan Breck waited for his kinsman to bring him the money he needed to escape. He explained to David that they were now caught up in a murder hunt. Their option was straightforward, to take to the heather or hang. Evading the redcoats, though, wasn't easy, and through sheer desperation, David and Alan had to try to make their way across the desolation of Rannoch Moor. But don't let that put you off, though. Rannoch Moor offers a superb trek through one of the wildest areas in Europe. A heather-clad desert of mountains, dark lochs and peat bog. So it's not surprising that Robert Louis Stevenson chose such a stunning and dramatic location. There is risk, danger here. Jan Robinson is warden of the remote Loch Ossian Eco Youth Hostel here in Rannoch Moor. So tell me a bit about what type of people come here, Jan.
Well, we have a very wide range of people come here, which of course we're really pleased about. The aims of the SYHA is to attract young people into the beautiful landscape of Scotland, but we do get people from all over the world.
Why is this place so attractive to people visiting the area?
People love the fact that it's well away from the madding crowd. It's really, really quiet. The quality of darkness here is remarkable. There's lots of wildlife around here, plenty of deer, and they actually come down to the hostel at night in winter.
This place is a wilderness. How dangerous can it be?
People just need to be very careful about what they're doing when they come here. It's ideal to be with somebody who knows how to read a compass and a map. We get information from people who come here about where they're going, and if they don't come back here or if they don't reach their destination, I would call the police and they would call the mountain rescue. So we do try and do our little bit towards keeping people safe.
I've noticed you have a wind turbine here. How eco-friendly is the hostel?
We're very proud of the fact that we're trying to leave as little trace on the earth as we can, and all our power comes from our wind turbine behind the hostel.
So just sum up for me, what is it that makes this place so special?
I think people love to be out in the wilderness. There's no phone signal here, there's no TV or radio signal, and I suppose people just get that experience of living in a more natural way for a while.
Munros are Scottish mountains more than 3,000 feet or 914 metres high, and there are nearly 300 of them. The Stevenson Way takes in several near Bridge of Orchy, where David Balfour and Alan Breck Stewart continued their flight from the pursuing authorities.
We set forth accordingly by this itinerary, and for the best part of 3 nights travelled on eerie mountains and among the wellheads of wild rivers, often buried in mist, almost continually blown and rained upon.
No long walk is complete without a cup of tea and what's known in Scotland as a fine piece, in this case a scone. I'm now in Rob Roy MacGregor country. The man himself lies buried about 100 metres from where I'm sitting. It was here in Balquhidder that David recuperated after the gruelling trip through the mountains and watched a bagpipe duel between Alan Breck and Rob Roy's murderous son, Robin Oig. The next part of the Stevenson Way takes us out of Balquhidder and on to Stirling. When they get to Stirling, they find that the bridge to Edinburgh is guarded. They have no option but to head east on the wrong side of the river to a place called Lime Kilns. It's there a bonny servant lass is persuaded to risk her freedom by rowing them across the River Forth.
"This'll never do," said Alan. "This'll never do for us, David." And without another word, he began to crawl away through the fields, and a little after, being well out of eyeshot, got to his feet again and struck along a road that led to the eastward. And here was I, back again, a wandering, hunted blackguard on the wrong side of the Forth.
We're now only a few miles away from the end of the Stevenson Way, Edinburgh. Before that, though, I've arranged to meet historian and Stevenson enthusiast Ian Nimmo for a drink at the Hawes Inn, South Queensferry, the place where Davy Balfour was first kidnapped. So you've walked the route, Ian. Tell me, what is it like?
To me, having read the book and then seeing the reality, things like Erid, where David Balfour is stuck on that little island because he's a country boy from the borders, and he doesn't realise that at low tide he can splash over. And when I first started off and stood on Erid and saw the tide, I mean, I didn't know whether I was going into 20 feet of water or whether I was going to be able to splash over. And suddenly you find the whole thing becomes real.
Just how authentic is the story?
Kidnapped is an accurate account of the state of Scotland in 1751, just these 6 years after the Battle of Culloden, right down to the manner of dress, where tartan was prescribed, right down to the mode of transport, what they ate, the guns that were there. It was a very accurate account, and of course Stevenson was basically an historian.
We came the byway over the hill of Corstorphine, and when we got near to the place called Rest and Be Thankful, and looked down on Corstorphine bogs and over to the city and the castle on the hill, we both stopped. For we both knew without a word said that we had come to where our ways parted. "Well, goodbye," said Alan, and held out his left hand. "Goodbye," said I, and gave the hand a little grasp, and went off downhill. Neither one of us looked the other in the face, nor so long as he was in my view did I take one back glance at the friend I was leaving. But as I went on my way to the city, I felt so lost and lonesome that I could have found it in my heart to sit down by the dike and cry and weep like any baby.
So here we are at the end of the Stevenson Way. We've travelled all 230 miles, all the way from Erie-on-Mull through some of the most remote and dramatic scenery in Scotland to here, Corstorphine Road in Edinburgh. Because it was on Corstorphine Hill, just behind me, that David and Alan finally part in the book. Kidnapped is a wonderful story, and it's so well loved that this statue of our two heroes was commissioned and eventually brought to life by the great Scottish sculptor Sandy Stoddart. And I think he's really captured the sort of wide-eyed lowland innocence of Davy and the glamorous, dangerous, healing nature of Alan. The Stevenson Way is not an easy long-distance walk. It's not signposted in any way, so you have to be able to navigate with map and compass and to know what you are doing out in some pretty rough terrain. But in many ways, it's like Stevenson's book. It's got drama, it's got excitement, it's got adventure every step of the way. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have.